Hello, and welcome back to a new episode of Sodor Streets and Statues. Today, I'm very happy to announce a bit of a relaunch and reshuffling of the podcast. Um, Previously, we've been operating under this kind of lecture type format where we pick a topic and I rant on about it for about 20 minutes, where I enjoy that very much. I don't think that's the best way to present these ideas and these subjects, particularly through a podcast format. So that's why we're restructuring it right now into a discussion format. And I'm very happy to bring on as a permanent co-host a good longtime friend of mine, Master of the Lemons, Lemmy.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Ted. I mean, I'm just, you and I have been having discussions just like the one that we were about to have for years. I mean, for those who don't know, me and Ted are the best of friends, and we've for years been having very in-depth railway series discussions that range from like very, very specific things like the track plan of Tidmouth to very, very broad things like the purpose of the railway in general. Everything that you can imagine, we've touched upon at one point or another, and we're just both extremely passionate. And it's why I'm just so happy to be on this show with you, Ted, because this is the embodiment of the conversations that we've had all these years. And I think that the kind of dialogue-driven format of the show is really gonna help to refine it a bit and to make it a little bit more engaging. So I'm just so happy to be here, really.
Exactly. Our conversations I always find them extremely interesting, and we can go on for hours.
For sure.
The book. But because of that, we're trying to keep our episodes in this series now guarded around one particular topic or another.
Oh, yeah.
Just so we can package these for distribution.
Because otherwise, we go on for hours if we didn't have a specific topic and guidelines.
And we're going to cover every topic there is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we got to keep it, we got to narrow the scope to the point where we have one, specific topic for episode. You want to introduce today's topic? Because it's a doozy.
Yes. So, today's topic is the lean years. When I say the lean years, I implicitly don't think I have to describe what it is, but
yeah, we both know by now what you mean by that. But it's like, but yeah.
But what does the lean year mean? Is that a dieting year? It's to do with the Skarloey Railway, a particular period of time in the Skarloey Railway, mostly in the 1930s into the early 1950s, when the railway had particularly low levels of resources.
Yeah, and it's really just kind of, it's defined by just kind of a very stressful period for everybody involved in it. Just the fact that all staff involved in the railway, all people involved in general, the engines, just it's the railway's really depressive period where it's really struggling to get by, and it varies depending on the specific year that you're talking about, and we'll get into all that.
Yes, I guess the best thing to do then before we get into the details with the lean years is to provide a big overview back of the book timeline on the Skarloey Railway itself.
Right.
Before we go deep into this category.
Yeah, because it's kind of hard to talk about one set of years without laying out the whole timeline, because it's all about context and contrast. So it's like, what is a hard period without first talking about the good periods and talking about how the railway started in general. So giving a quick overview, I think, is the way to really put it in context as to how difficult this period really was.
I typically tend to put the Skarloey Railway's history into four categories. When the railway was built, it was built by the Crovansgate Mining Company, and that was the owners of it until about 1909. And that during 1909, it was bought by Sir Handel Brown, who is the namesake for the engine, Sir Handel, and was in the books that he's referred to as the owner, as the sole owner, and him and his son were known long term in the series as the owners of the Skarloey Railway. But then within Sir Handel Brown, the first ownership of the railway, there's kind of two areas. There was during the lean years, as we're going to be discussing, and then there was before the lean years.
Right.
And then Sir Handel II's run of the railway is kind of what we're all used to for the Skarloey Railway, at least after the first 3 or 4 years.
Right.
The second.
Most of the time, I think when we talk about the owner of the Skarloey Railway, that even if people don't know the name of that figure, it's pretty much Sir Handel Brown II. Like, that is the figure that people are picturing, even if they don't know a lot about him or what his name is. It's pretty much him, because he takes over in the 50s. But and that's where most of the stories that people are most invested in when it comes to the Skarloey Railway take place. But not to sell the first one short either, because there's 2 Sir Handel Browns here. Nobody be mistaken. Which is 2 more Sir Handels than anybody is ever used to. But basically, the first and the second are they're very distinct, and they each have a vital role to play in this whole history.
Yeah, but the general characteristics is that first area under the Crovan's Gate Mining Code. That's what's the name of the book about the old engines?
Old engines.
Very old engines. That would be it.
Yeah.
That's what you would expect. That book is kind of indicative of what you would expect of the sort of Crovan's Gate Mining Company.
Right. The very early days. The days where you had Mr. Mac in charge. The days where this is the Skarloey and Rheneas back to back on the cover book we're talking about. This is the cabless engines book. This is the ancient times era that we're talking. And
what's really not explored is during the time of Sir Handel the First, because most of the books take place during Sir Handel II.
Right.
There's only really one story during Sir Handel the First, and it's only a flashback.
Right.
In a book set in a different time period. And that's where I think...
Which story is that? Is it the one Skarloey remembers? Is that the...
Oh, I thought it was Gallant Old Engine. I might be incorrect, and there might be 2.
Yeah, I think there's a few that are, but they're not explicit, and they're not really any, like, the one I'm thinking of isn't really any good for the purpose. but yeah. In strictly era timeline kind of rules. But so pretty much, he doesn't... Sir Handel Brown I as a figure doesn't really get a lot of screen time, for lack of a better word. And as a result, a lot of his history is kind of confined to Island of Sodor, people, history, and railways, which we might want to define right now. When Ted and I talk about Island of Sodor, people, history, and railways, we may just call it the book sometimes. That may just be the description that we use, because we're so used... It is
the only book.
Yeah, because the thing is, we bring up that book so much. It really is the backbone of the Railway series, the way we see it, because it just has so much foundational information that gives context to all of the stories in the Railway series. So sometimes we'll just refer to the book if we don't say people, history, and railways, and it's that book is what we mean. There's also another book that will come into play at some point, so it's going to get confusing. But don't worry, we'll hold your hand. We'll actually be very clear on what we mean and which book is which.
There's many books, and Lemmy, I will be relying on you to help assist in that context. As one thing I am not is clear.
Yeah, and that's very fair, Ted. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean, the two of us, you're very much you're an encyclopedia when it comes to the Railway series encyclopedia, and all this information like the back of your hand, and you have very insightful kind of views on it. But at the same time, it's the world that you live in, and so you don't necessarily contextualize it for everybody around you, because a lot of it is just by default. It's just what you're used to. And I live a little bit more in the TV series fantasy land, just enough that I can kind of bridge that gap, because I don't always think in those terms. I kind of live in both worlds. So yeah, I'll give clarifications like that where needed and where possible, of course.
Yeah. Well, I guess with that, without any further ado, let's dive into the lean years.
Yes, let's dive in.
So first fun fact of the day, Skarloey Railway, we kind of know it for slate.
Right.
But when it was built for copper. And even the mines that we know as the slate mines, originally those Wardenfell mines were used for copper.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, no, pretty much.
And the first milepost in the context that we're talking about is when Sir Handel first bought the railway, and that's because the mines were more or less running out of copper.
Yeah, no, pretty much. The original purpose, I mean, the reason that the Crovan's Gate Mining Company was even interested in those mines, and when we say Ward Fell, that's just the geographical kind of name for that area. That's just the mountain. Would you call it a mountain?
Yeah. Fell translates literally into mountain.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so so we've got Ward Fell there, and that's where the mines are. And the Crovan's Gate Mining Company totally loses interest once they run out of copper, because that's the whole reason they set up there in the first place. They sell it to Sir Handel Brown I, which at this point we're just calling Sir Handel Brown because he's the only Sir Handel Brown. But that's the key time. 1909, right?
1909 is when Sir Handel Brown bought the railway, and during this time he was a member of Parliament for Sodor East, which is the area of Sodor where
right,
or this is. And additionally to that, he in general was kind of a wealthy landowner of the valley.
Right. So he had a lot of power, a lot of influence and say.
A lot of wealth, and he did it mostly though out of really a service and utility to the people living in the valley.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of those people, it was their main artery of transportation.
Right. Without the railway, they'd be utterly screwed. And I think this is where I really start to get interested in Sir Handel Brown as a person, and why I think he's really interesting. And it's a tragedy more hasn't been done with him in fan content, absolutely in the show, which is Mr. Percival Central. There's literally him and nothing else. Sir Handel Brown he strikes me as an extremely magnanimous character. He's very generous, and he cares a lot about the people around him and about the people who live in this part of the island. A lot of whom, live on his land, right? This is a guy who cares about his community, and in fact will take a financial hit to protect and to give transportation to people who really desperately need it. Because this is a wealthy guy. He could just squander his wealth, and he could just he could make decisions that don't benefit the little guy at all. He doesn't do that. Instead, he makes decisions that benefit everybody, and sometimes at detriment to himself. In fact, there's that one line in People, History, and Railways. We were just reading it earlier. Should I read that now, Ted? It's a really good line.
Sure, why not?
Yeah, so I was reading this earlier, and this line, I knew who Sir Handel Brown was as a person, but I think that this direct quote is really going to kind of cement who he was, because it's really good.
One thing that's interesting about Sir Handel Brown, in my view, is that this is getting rather niche, but in the United Kingdom, the two historic political parties were the Liberals and the Conservative parties, going back for a long period of time until post World War II, when Labour Party got more popular than the Liberals, and the Liberal Party became a very minor party then on after. And still to this day in the form of the Liberal Democrats. But Sir Handel Brown was a member for the Liberal Party in the parliaments during the period where the Liberal Party was on the way out and the Labour was on the way in.
Right.
In the parliaments, we're talking about where Liberals were no longer the second largest party, or of course the third largest party.
Right.
I don't know what this says about Sir Handel Brown himself, or Sodor politics, or maybe even the Reverend's view of politics.
Right. Probably most of all that last one, yeah.
Most of all that last one.
Right.
But it kind of fits it, because a bit of that caricature, the archetype of what a National Liberal would stand for during that period is kind of what I imagine Sir Handel Brown would stand for, in terms of it's not a Labour Party, which is kind of much more revolutionary, to put it in vulgar terms.
Right, yeah.
But a bit more kind of on, I guess, anti-traditional in a sense.
Right.
The Labour Party was still very traditional, but it's the Liberal Party was very traditional, but still very much philanthropic.
Right.
But it's an interesting mixture. It fits the character that he's been painted out to be very well.
That's interesting. Does it? Where does it say that? His political affiliation?
It says it in the book that he ran as a. It says initially he was elected 2 years after he bought the railway, or actually 1 year he was elected. Coincidence, I think not.
Yeah.
Buying the Skarloey Railway was all a political power grab.
Exposed. No. but yeah, I love that there's stuff like that in here. I mean, this book is so thick. I've never seen that before, but I totally believe you. Like that's great. And it's interesting too, because I don't think anybody ever, very few people I'd say that I've talked to, think about the political structure of the island. But, I'm right in saying that there'd be 2 members of parliament then for the East and the West?
I believe so.
Yeah, so we're dealing with the Eastern one. And that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's like one of the leading figures on the island. And that guy happens to care a lot about the people and be philanthropic, like you said, which is really cool. It makes him just a really good character. And speaking of him, I found the phrasing here. So I'll read this through. He finally bought the mining company out in 1909, closed the copper mine, but kept the slate quarry and railway open. They proved profitable till 1924, broke even for some years, and thereafter ran at a loss. But he was determined to keep them open during his lifetime for the sake of his people, whatever it costs to me. That's a badass line right there. Like, it's quoted there as if that's like literally what the guy said. Like, that was like, whatever it costs me, I must take care of my people, which is just so cool. It's such a definitive stance. He knows what his priorities are, and he's disregarding the cost. He's disregarding the financial cost in favor of the human cost, which is just beautiful and a really good start for the Skarloey Railway, a railway that we really look up to and see as a railway that is underdog in nature. I think it's clear that it was already on that trajectory. It's neat that this is the guy who swoops in and does this.
And I think that line also provides the perfect context to the era, where when he first bought the railway, he was transitioning from copper into slate.
Yeah.
And slate was initially profitable, particularly during World War One. The slate was very profitable.
Right.
But then as the 20s kind of stopped, from middle 20s, it went from profitable to break even. And then by the 1930s, it's very suiting that the lean years take place in the 1930s initially.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's, I guess before we move on, there's one very interesting passage about Glennick during pre-lean years and post-lean years.
Right.
I would love to mention. So Glennick is the first station up when you're going away from Crovan's Gate on the Skarloey line.
I think I know what you're about to say, and this is some other really good Sir Handel Brown stuff.
And it's a very interesting. The one illustration we have of it. There's some illustrations with a passing loop and some illustrations with a single track, and the book kind of explains away the need for a passing loop in a passage about a particular church train that Sir Handel Brown put on in the 1920s and 1910s,
right?
Where one train would leave from Skarloey and one train would leave from Crovan's Gate, taking people to the Methodist Church at Glennick, which you can see in the illustration of Glennick. Having the chapel be connected right to the platform.
I think that's just so fitting. It reminds me of that old quote from Audrey. The thing he says about, like, the church and railways are very similar. They're, both think that they have the right way of doing things. Both are, extremely methodical, and both think that they are the best means of getting man to his ultimate destination. That's the ultimate. Yeah, that's the ultimate combination, isn't it? Station and church in one.
I love that quote so much. I believe the first part of it was both are encumbered by a significant amount of costly Victorian architecture.
Yeah, that's great. Encumbered is the word.
I'm paraphrasing there, but the quote about both being uneconomical because of Victorian architecture is very clear.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, one of the first examples of how the book uses the lean years to explain how does the lean years affect a station was that, these trains are canceled, where it was kind of almost a frivolous train just because to support the local community. When the railway wasn't making money, they couldn't pay for it.
Right. They're canceled. Like, what's the year here?
It says in the book during the lean years, so I take that in the 1930s it would be canceled in the early 30s, because it says that 24 was the point where it started to just break even, and it says for some years, and eventually it started to lose money, and when it started to lose money, that was the start of the lean years.
Right.
And I at least in my head, it's a very easy transition. 1930s for lean years and 1920s good, partly because it's the Depression.
Right. I mean, that's immediately when I think of the 30s. I think the Great Depression, and it's cool to see how it affects Sodor and how it affects the characters that we care about. And
but applied to this one station, there's the passing siding is taken out because they don't need it anymore, and they've lost their kind of special service to it.
Yeah,
and that's
really,
just kind of,
it's not good for morale. Firstly, I mean, that's you got to think about how people would feel about that. And
it's a negative feedback loop too,
right?
Because take it that's just the one station. Everything that we just said there probably applies to the rest of the line. As the railway becomes uneconomic, it probably raises fares. As it raises fare, less tourists come. It's a negative feedback loop.
Right.
During the Depression, people don't go for vacations as they used to in the spas of Skarloey Lake. At the same time, the freight revenue is drying up. It's an all negative feedback loop. And because of a decade of lack of investment in the line, the spas and resorts at Skarloey become out of date.
Right.
They become faded. They become something of a different era.
The railway's hallmarks, the things that people are traveling for, are becoming less and less desirable, and it's just things are just getting worse.
And there's nothing really to get them out of the spiral.
Right.
And that's kind of what the pre-World War II is like on the railway.
Right.
But it's still there. The railway's still there. The core of it's still there. It's still running, but it's just kind of going downhill, but slowly.
It's becoming more of a skeleton. And I think I'm seeing some very distinctive eras here, kind of the ones we outlined at the beginning. You've got the pre-1909 era, which is kind of the Mr. Mac led kind of Crovan's Gate Mining Company. Very early days, very different era. That's very old.
Or it's a company just being run for profit, just like any company is.
Yeah, and then you've got this very clear shift in 1909, where all of a sudden the focus is not fully profit anymore. It's the people. It's running it because you care about the people who live along your line and who depend upon you. And that changes entirely. And
you depend upon for getting elected.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, Sir Handel Brown is in that position. So, he's taking care of them, and they're in return keeping him in power as well. But basically, he's taking care of the people. And the railway's purpose shifts at that time, and I think becomes softer and becomes also just more concerned with the well-being of the people that use it, which I think is a lot more recognizable to pretty much all of us. When we think about the Skarloey Railway, we don't think about kind of the harsher years, which were profitable and which were they were turning a profit. But it didn't have that same tenderness, that same kind of kindness that the Skarloey Railway emanated. Yeah, the heart. Yeah, the heart comes into it 1909. The heart comes into it when Sir Handel Brown comes into the railway. He's the one who injects that Skarloey Railway feeling into it, and and then at the same time, the Depression and the fact that the railway is just not making a profit kind of steals that heart back out of it, despite his best efforts. And you shut down vital services that the community really cares about and is important to them, like this church service that is just so important to the people along this line, to the point where that would be the main event of every Sunday. So you can imagine how things are getting grimmer for the railway when we transition into the 30s. And and the 30s are, I'm sure, a very bleak period where the railway is still getting by, but not well. It's living, but it's not living well at all. And that's, I think, when we get to World War II. That's when we get to the 40s.
And that's when things really start to accelerate in terms of the whole process. We don't know much about World War II, period, other than the fact the slate from the mining of it was very much accelerated.
Right.
And the slate was was used in the reconstruction effort for bombed out blitzed houses.
Right.
And also at the period, one thing I would love your take on, Lemmy, is these loaned engines.
Oh yeah, this is a very interesting point to me. Yeah, so can we find the passage specifically where they talk about this? Because it's really interesting. Audrey has a habit of this. He just throws engines into the history of the Railway series. He just mentions them in passing like, oh yes, well, they were here all along. And I think that's really cool because it shows that, I mean, when a railway exists for over 100 years, there's a lot of periods that you don't know much about and that you suddenly hear. I can imagine, being at Crovan's Gate at the headquarters and you're going through an old drawer and you see a picture of an engine you've never seen before and you're like, what the hell is this? And you hear from somebody who's been here a long time, oh yeah, that came over in the war. It's kind of a crazy idea when you think about it. So the idea is that some engines were loaned to the Skarloey Railway in order to help it get through the war, basically. Or really to allow the Skarloey Railway to help the war effort, because it's not really about helping the Skarloey. It's about the Skarloey helping the effort, and they can't really do it with just Skarloey and Rheneas. It's not feasible, because they've already been running on empty for the last 20 years, some 10, 20, the last 15 years, say, they've been running on empty. And so they're not in a position to, ramp up how much slate they're sending out. It's just not feasible. So they have to send in other engines to help them out. And these engines, we know nothing about them, but we know that they were there. And we know that Skarloey and Rheneas weren't always alone on this line, which is kind of crazy to think about that, isn't it? The fact that there were engines on the Skarloey Railway before Sir Handel and Peter Sam show up. Like, we kind of look at it like it was Skarloey and Rheneas alone running this line for that whole stretch. But there was a period during the war years where there were some mysterious other engines here. I
got the passage if you would like it.
Oh yeah, please read it, because that'll give us a good jumping off point for this.
So it also has some other information about World War II in the same passage,
good.
Which is helpful for conversation. During World War II, the old mines have been commandeered in sections for ammunition dumps, and the line was worked to the limits, providing slate for blitz houses, pit props for mines. The borrowed locomotives, that's the only context it has, is in past tense.
Right.
In past tense.
Yeah.
The borrowed locomotives and stock, implying that rolling stock was also borrowed, had now gone. So it said, it doesn't, I can't find anywhere where it says it in future tense saying they came, but it says here the context of
they were taken away.
Had gone by the end of World War II.
Right, I know. And Audrey has a habit.
Left with his own rolling stock and track, which were shockingly run down, implying that the war effort and all these borrowed. What I kind of envision this of is that you have little Skarloey and Rheneas putzing through the 30s, like not it's not horrible yet, but they're just getting by and they're just making do with what they can.
Right.
And then the war comes and they're flooded with extra engines and rolling stock,
right.
and their mines like taken over and strip-minded sections, and then ammunition dumped in other sections.
Right.
And then all their track is run over so many times it starts to get warped out of place. And that by the end, and meanwhile they don't clean up any of it when they're there.
Good God.
And then they just left. They just leave.
Yeah.
And I have no clue the character implications of these.
No, here's the thing. They'd be total jerks, right? I mean, they'd have to be. Because the thing is, they come in here, and look, they've been sent in here to do a job, right? So I get why they're here. I get that they're being told to work this railway to the limit. But imagine how Skarloey and Rheneas would feel. They have been carefully tending to and maintaining this railway, just barely trying to get it to survive for the last several years. And then these other engines that are probably like 3 years old, right? Like that aren't even... Skarloey and Rheneas at this point, they're already old, okay? They are... Let's do the math here. They're what? They're 35 plus 40. They're like 70 years old already, okay? Way older than you'd ever expect a steam engine to get, right? So they're already ancient. They're already elders. You would expect that these new engines would come in and think, wow, you're so you're so you have so much wisdom, and you've been keeping this company running for how long? And they would be really impressed, right? But instead, they just come in here like, all right, pipsqueaks, come on, we gotta get all this slate out of here as fast as we can. Get out of my way, old man. And Rheneas would be like, watch it, like it would be. There's just kind of this whirlwind, right, throughout the 40s, where all of a sudden this sleepy old line that's very tired, all of a sudden just all these new engines, all this new stock.
But before the 40s, it was still well maintained. Like, it was not a lot of resources, but what was being maintained was well taken care of.
That's the
and with
thing.
a lot of heart. The heart was really there and kept it alive.
It is the equivalent of a rundown little home with a family that doesn't have a lot of money, but they don't have a lot, but they take care of what they have. So their furniture isn't expensive, but it's always dusted, and it's always repaired when there's a problem with it. And there's it's like that quaint little home with an old couple living in it, and it's almost like the house from Up, It's like that sort of thing where they're just taking good care of it, even if it's run down and they don't have a lot of money. But then all of a sudden, you just have this whirlwind come through it, and you have a bunch of engines operating on this rail line that don't have any respect for it, don't have any respect for the history, because they're just here to do the job and get through the war. And once they pack up and leave, they don't really care too much what happens to Skarloey and Rheneas.
And I bet Skarloey and Rheneas had a stiff upper lip during it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Didn't complain. They just kind of, and they probably, had drivers, and they probably had management come in and ask them to work harder than they were able to work.
Right, exactly.
And it's strongly implied that Skarloey got worn out during the war years.
Right.
It was strongly implied that after the war years, Rheneas was left to operate the railway by himself for a bit over a decade.
Right.
Or not a bit over, just for 6 years by himself.
Right.
But it's
really
strongly implied the war is what ran Skarloey to the bone.
Yeah, which I'm sure just would piss Rheneas the hell off. But I could really see it where stiff upper lip is the word. Throughout the war, they'd have these bigger engines, these newer engines that don't have the history, haven't been through nearly as much as they have. They have new management coming in. They have all this stuff, right? And they are, and they just kind of, a big engine bustles by and says, all right, I've got to make sure I get this train, to Croven's Gate quick as possible. Don't get in my way. And he rumbles past, and he's like, he does some damage to the rails and bends them a little bit. And Rheneas just kind of bites his tongue, like, well, that's not how I would have done it, but we need the help.
They got a war to fight.
Yeah, exactly.
People's homes need to get built, and the slate in that train is rebuilding people's houses.
Exactly. There is a cause greater than their railway. So Rheneas bites his tongue. But then I think by the very end, when the last engine leaves and Skarloey and Rheneas are just sitting there, they'd kind of just sit there in silence for a while as they see the narrow gauge engines that have been helping them on a flatbed being taken away from Croven's Gate. Rheneas would just be sitting there and just decompressing, like, and then the roof falls in on the sheds. And Skarloey would just be like, God damn it! And eventually they would just snap, right? At that moment, they'd just be like, oh!
What I could really see is, in 1941, 1940, that would be one thing, right?
Right.
Like, that's the actual time during the Blitz, during the Battle of Britain, where that's where Skarloey Railway would not have one question or the other. But there was a serious period there, particularly in 1944 and 45, when the fighting wasn't, there was the occasional air raid still, but the intensity of the war had started to cool down.
Right. And yet these engines are still here, and they're still mining them to hell.
Yeah, and I could see that point particularly being like, okay, we've been trying so hard for the war effort, but there's not as many blitzed out houses anymore, and it's the arguments of why you would have to have a stiff upper lip for changing.
Exactly.
And what I like to think, the beginning of the war period was really focused on mining out the slate and trying to do things to help.
Right.
And the later periods of the war, they said they're starting to use sections of the mine for munition dumps.
Right.
That's where that would more come in.
Yeah, no, exactly.
More just the destructive part during the last year.
Like Rheneas would hear about that. And I imagine Rheneas is Skarloey and Rheneas definitely have quite different personalities. I imagine that Rheneas is the sterner of the two and would probably be not more confrontational, because I think he's extremely disciplined and respectful, but I think that Skarloey would not dare stand up to these engines on this railway that have come in. I think Rheneas might raise a word to them. He might be like, "What are you dumping up in the hills?" And they're just like, "It's none of your business. It is my business. I've curated this railway for the last 70 years. What's up in the hills?" Well, it's the spoils of war, and I do mean the spoils. "Are you dumping munitions up there?" "Well, yeah." And then Rheneas would be like, did we give you permission for this?" "No, we don't need your permission." And Rheneas would just kind of scowl like, But he would end the conversation there. He wouldn't go any further, but he's just like kind of boiling underneath, kind of underneath his calm exterior. He's just kind of like, "They are abusing their privileges. They are overstaying their welcome at this point. We let them in with no complaint, and here they are, misusing our railway, which we took care of for years. We've run it for 70, they're running it down in 5. Like, underneath the hood, if you really see what his emotions are telling him, he's pissed off. But he's trying to keep a calm exterior, because Rheneas is very, very good at that. But I imagine, once these guys are gone, Rheneas would have a few choice words that he would finally let out, And at that point, but I think what would really, really get to him is the fact that, Skarloey, who he just views as Skarloey, I think, is the more vulnerable of the two of them, I'd say. The more emotional.
Like my opinion on Skarloey is that he just saw these engines destroying the railway and said, "Okay, well, I'll just take all the trains I can then."
Right.
And he worked himself to the bone, because instead of trying to negotiate and argue like Rheneas was,
right,
he just kind of tried to burden the work.
Especially if you got two of these new engines on either side, kind of telling Skarloey, "Go on, take the train." And like Rheneas would know that this long slate train's like too much for Skarloey, but they'd expect the same of him that they expect of themselves, and they'd be like, "Go on, take it up." And Skarloey's just like, all right, and he takes it, And
it could be that, but I also interpret during the early war years, particularly, that Skarloey's pushing himself to get Slate to houses.
Yeah, kind of to have more power over the situation and to see the tragic situation he's in and say, "I'm going to do as much as possible to actually change this."
Like people need Slate to rebuild their homes, and if I take it down the line's going to be better respected than these other engines.
Right.
I'm going to wear it down less. And I'm going to work as hard and as much hours as I can on the rails.
Right. So he takes the damage that's going into the line and puts it into himself instead to preserve it. He knows,
that's how I see it. Yes, he takes the damage to the line.
Because if he takes extra trains, I imagine one of these big guys, right, is about to go off with a train, right? He's putting sand down. You can tell he's about to hammer those tracks, right? And he's like, "All right, here I go." But then Skarloey will be like, "You know what? You could take a rest. You've been working a lot. I could take over for you." And he's like, "Well, all right, if you're sure." And he backs off the train.
That's exactly what I see.
Right.
I don't see Skarloey being bullied. I see Skarloey sacrificing himself.
That's good.
For the
because that puts the power in his hands. And,
yes, I don't see him being bullied. I see him sacrificing.
And that's cool, Ted. I wouldn't have thought of that. Which is why I love these conversations. So
like the stiff upper lip. Like if anyone was going to run this railway to the point where it won the war, and I see Rheneas exactly how you described him.
Right.
As being kind of the more the bulldog fighting off against it.
Right.
Where it's almost in the way that Rheneas was the one who just put his nose down and got to work later on.
Right.
Skarloey was doing that, and Rheneas learned that attitude from Skarloey in the war years.
Right.
But in the war years, Rheneas was trying to fight against it and being a bit of a bulldog on it. But
it's interesting how they I can see how these characters evolve. Because in the very beginning, in the early days, pre-1909, which I guess is how I describe the very old engines era now, you've got Skarloey and Rheneas, where Skarloey, in the early days especially, is extremely immature. And Rheneas is the one who's more mature and more grounded. But I think part of that is just that Rheneas has extreme principle, and Skarloey's more flexible. And I think that as we go on, that becomes clear as Rheneas is more stubborn in this situation, where he's not gonna let these other engines kind of run all over his railway. He is going to take a bit of a stand. Whereas Skarloey's going to look at the situation and say, all right, I can do something about this. It's maybe not going to be the best for my system, but it'll be better for my railway if I do it. Whereas Rheneas he still has that principle. He's seeing these engines coming in, showing no respect, and he meets lack of respect with stubbornness, the same way he did with Skarloey back in the early days. But in this situation, Skarloey actually does more for the railway by being flexible and by deciding, you know what, I'm going to take the punches. These guys might be doing damage to the railway, so, I'm going to take over from them whenever I can. Because that way, the tracks will be taken care of. That way, I'm not going to be slamming this railway to oblivion. Instead, I'm going to be, I'm going to be taking more care of it. And he does. But it wreaks havoc on his system. And by the end of the war, he's in a terrible state. And Rheneas partially probably feels bad about it because he hasn't taken those same measures. He hasn't been as self-sacrificing as Skarloey has because he's been trying to fight off the inevitable, whereas Skarloey accepted the inevitable. And
Exactly.
Yes.
And I could kind of see by the end of the war, Rheneas is okay. I'm kind of like, oh, look at this Skarloey. Look at the state of things. And he doesn't notice that Skarloey is the one that's
Right.
in worse state than
Exactly.
other things.
Like,
He's so
I
busy
imagine
fighting with
it'd be
this
something like that where I imagine like the two of them going up and down the line doing a survey of the whole place just to see what kind of condition things are in. And like I'm imagining, just indulge this, that they're buffer to buffer going up the whole length of the line. And seeing like Rheneas is taking note of, look at the platforms, the state of them, and look at this bridge, and oh, the rails are warped beyond all repair. And he's talking to Skarloey throughout this journey, as notes are taken. And then he realizes halfway through Skarloey has stopped steaming. He's like, his load gets heavier, and he realizes he's pulling Skarloey as well as the surveying train. And he realizes, Skarloey? And he's like passed out behind him. And at that point he'd realize, oh my God, stop! And then, and the men are like, and at this, who would be on this surveying train, do you think? If there were...
it would be David Hugh. And that time he was the foreman of the railway, in charge of
so immediately
maintenance.
after World War II, it'd be David Hugh. So, which is the original Mr. Hugh. So you've got, Mr. David Hugh kind of on the surveying, and he's, Rheneas is like, we have to stop, and he's like, and Hugh would be like, well, no, hold on, we've got to check on the rest of the track, we've still got a few stations to go to yet, and Rheneas is like, no, stop, forget the track, look at Skarloey, and he looks back, and he's in a terrible state, and they finally like kind of zoom out from their kind of fishbowl effect that they've got over this whole situation, and they're like, oh my, we need to get him back to the sheds. And they do, and they look him over, and they're like, Jesus, oh my God, like, we've totally lost sight of how much damage has been done to him. And honestly, Rheneas begins to realize, like, maybe even during the war years, Rheneas was like, Skarloey, you're running yourself to bits, you have to be more careful, right? Not realizing that, like, he's doing it for the railway. And then they do another survey without Skarloey. Now Skarloey's in the back of the shed, and Rheneas realizes, hey, it's bad, but it could be so much worse. And I think that's because of him, isn't it? And Mr. Hugh just agrees, and it's like, they're like, wow, and Rheneas is inspired by the effort that Skarloey's put in.
Exactly. That's exactly how I view it. And that really does take us to the post-war years.
It really does,
It really is that. Where, like, for the next, from 1945 to 1950, the next 5 years, it really is just Rheneas limping along.
Exactly. And this right here,
ruins.
This is the period, I think, that everybody remembers, because this right here is Gallant Old Engine. I mean, this is when everybody thinks of the lean years, they think of Rheneas limping along. And the truth is, there's a large assortment of lean years. I mean, we talked about the 30s, which is the lean years.
There's three subsections of lean years. There's the early lean years, there's the wartime, and there's post-war.
Exactly, yeah. And the wartime doesn't look quite like the lean years because it's extremely busy and it's very different from what we're used to. But it punctuates it. It's kind of a sudden acceleration of the deterioration of the railway. And then when we get out of it on the other end, the railway's in such a horrendous state And Rheneas is the only one who's in a position to actually to run the railway. Skarloey has passed out at the back of the shed. He can't do this anymore. And Rheneas, realizes that it all falls on his shoulders. And this to me...
But even in this, there's two distinct eras in this post-war lean years.
That's true.
During Sir Handel the First and Sir Handel the Second. Before we get into that whole transition and talking about the gallant old engine and Sir Handel the Second type things, it is well enough to note that during Sir Handel the First, the railway was still supported enough to keep operating.
That's
like
true.
Sir Handel, it was lean but not extinct. Like Sir Handel the First did given enough resources to keep going to mend what was actually broken, but nothing more. But the where things get kind of insane is during Sir Handel II's era, which is the next chapter. I'm happy to jump to that chapter now.
Oh yeah, for sure. So this is the real big turning point. Is the year is 1950, and Sir Handel Brown, really the heart of the railway. Up until this point, and the man who really turned it into what we know as the Skarloey Railway, who has been carefully nursing it and supplying it with the support that it needs financially for all this time, he dies. And it makes a tremendous difference to the Skarloey Railway, because the burden now falls upon his son, Sir Handel Brown II. So you want to talk about that, Ted? About how this affects him?
He had all sorts of financial restructurings to do with his father's death.
Right.
All sorts of death duties and taxes to pay, and the situation wasn't as economic situation wasn't straight-handed to him, and he was a very philanthropic person. A lot of the times when wealthy people die, they have a huge amount of debt and a huge amount of unprofitable things. A lot of time when wealthy people die, they don't have a dollar to their name because of how much debt they've taken out against their assets.
Right, exactly.
and on top of that, if you have to pay taxes or death duties on your assets, that means you have to sell your capital to get the liquid assets to pay the tax.
Right, yeah.
And that's very much the situation Sir Handel II was in.
Yeah. He's bearing the weight of his father's philanthropy for all these years. All of a sudden, he enters into this situation, and he's basically. You worded it very well earlier, Ted, when we were talking. You said that you said something along the lines of, he's kind of got to. He's got to make enough money to keep the railway, essentially.
Yeah, basically, he has to pay the duties on his father's estates. He has to have enough money to pay the duties.
Right.
Otherwise, the taxman will come and collect the railway as payment.
Right. Yeah.
Or his other estates, etc. So he's in a critical position right now where he just can't afford it.
Right.
And he was planning to close the railway down right then and there and liquidate it.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for two individuals who had been working at that railway at the time, not in a senior position and kind of middle-level positions, but Ivo, Hugh, and Peter Sand, whose fathers were in the senior positions as foreman and as controller.
Right.
But the son of the foreman and the son of the controller, and they went to Sir Handel II and said, "Give us 1 year to run this railway, delay closure by 1 year, and we'll try to have it turned around." And meanwhile, Sir Handel goes and lays off all the other staff, including his father.
And that's the insane part. That's what really gets me, is that, like, you look at illustrations of Rheneas in operation in Gallant Old Engine, and you see his driver and fireman. You see that you see his crew, right? And that's it. That's the staff. Like, it's not like there's all these...
off the maintenance crews, the station staff, the X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. Literally, it's two guys running the entire Skarloey Railway. Isn't that nuts? Like to anybody who's picturing the TV series, just think about all the shots. Think about all the scenes where you've got a huddle of workmen somewhere. Think about the shots that have 7 or 8 people. Workmen and drivers and firemen, and that wasn't there. 2 guys on the whole railway running things. Imagine
Think about that for a run-down railway. who had just been crippled as opposed to well-maintenance.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not even. I mean, imagine trying to run an entire railway with you and one other person, let alone doing it with a railway that's on the brink of failure. It's insane.
Imagine you and I running over.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, if you and I tried to do that, it'd be nuts. Oh my god.
We would do. We're too much of a bleeding heart. We definitely would.
That's true. Yeah, we would put everything aside, and actually, we would. I couldn't bear not to.
But they did this out of love and hope and vision of the railway. They had a vision that this railway could be so much more.
Right.
And they worked, and it's not said clearly anywhere if they got pay or not, but they were the only two staff.
Right.
And the railway was meant to be closed, and they went and asked Sir Handel to keep it on for a year. I don't know if they were even paid or not.
Yeah, I mean,
they might have not been paid.
It was hardly a company at that point. It was just a few men doing what they thought they had to do. And it's like, that's nuts to me. I mean, Peter Sam and Ivo Hugh, this is where these two characters enter our story. And they make a hell of a dent in this railway's history. In fact, they ensure that there is a history to continue.
But despite their efforts, there almost wasn't.
Right, yeah.
And there was two key events that people don't know about that context and frame Gallant Old Engine.
Right.
And context and frame this whole struggle more than just these two individuals. It's very niche. So in all, there's two separate areas. So the quarry is completely mined out and unusable now,
right?
Especially with munitions in it. So there's no freight traffic.
Right. They've dumped a bunch of waste in it, and now it's ruined.
Exactly. During this period, and I'm in my headcanon, it's a Sir Ivo. It's not Sir Ivo Hugh. I did this earlier too. I think Ivo Hugh should be a sir and a saint for all what he's done.
Ted, if anyone can't tell, Ted has an extreme admiration for Ivo Hugh, and very occasionally will add "sir" in front of his name by accident because of that immense respect.
That's just my view of him. If I saw him in person, I would only call him "sir" as my only prefix.
Right.
But they discovered a new slate mine near Reneus,
which is a huge deal because all of a sudden we've got a new lease on life. Because this railway only survived so long because of slate. Now we're at a slate in one place, we find it in another. That's a huge deal.
That's the background cash flow. That's what's paying to keep the rails maintained and the engines with coal in their bunker.
Right. But that's still not enough to make the railway live well. That's not enough to. I mean, it's still that's how to get back to that's how to get back to
keep the lean years going.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than turning it into the dead years, it's just the lean years. So that slate quarry at Reneus, that's a big deal, but that's still only a lifeline. That is,
and I imagine this as in their spare time that Ivo Hugh and Peter Sam would go around trying to find new mine sites.
Right, that's a cool idea. Like desperately looking, like they're like, there's got to be something.
That's my headcanon, is that they personally try to go and find a new traffics with all their free time. Right. Yeah. Including mine sites. And
I could totally see that because they definitely care more than anybody else about this, and I mean, it's just, who else is really going to do it? Who else is going to have that amount of dedication to the railway to literally stumble over? It's kind of like the search for Duke, except way more difficult and, way more walking, way more searching, way more tapping rocks and trying to figure things out.
Yeah. And the other one, which is another this one is pure circumstance. I can't imagine how they were involved in finding it, or even knowing what it was, but it contexts everything about the Skarloey Railway, the past, present, and future, in this one other discovery. The book literally mentions 2 bullet points of what saved the railway. Right. The slate quarry is one, and then what I'm about to mention is the second. In Alstead Castle, in the archives of the island, a lost document was discovered, which chronicled a period of time in Sodor's history. Sodor has this very long geopolitical history of kings and wars and being a part of the King of the Isles versus independence versus subjugation from other people. But there was a period where Sodor was independent. And then there was a 100-year period where Sodor didn't have a king and faced foreign invasion by both Scotland and England. Right. And during this 100-year period, the regents of Sodor, regents a word describing someone ruling, waiting for the king to rightly claim the throne,
Right.
But the regents of Sodor hid out in Skarloey, and Skarloey was the base for 100 years of guerrilla warfare from the local Sudric population against the foreign invaders.
Right.
And every time the Sudric spirit was attempted to be snuffed out by one of these invaders, they would retreat to their hidden lakeside, the hidden lake in the woods, Skarloey.
So, which is just amazing, like that's the case, because that means that Skarloey, for 100 years, was quite literally the heart of Sodor. That was the most Sudrian place on the entire island. And isn't that so great? Isn't that so... Because when we think of the Skarloey Railway, we think of it being the oldest operating railway on the island. We think of Skarloey and Rheneas being the two most Sudrian engines you could possibly picture. Like, Skarloey Railway is peak Sodor. It is the utter essence of what makes Sodor what it is, and what we think of when we picture this island. And it's... And in the history of their namesake station, their namesake town, that is an extremely crucial part of Sodor's history. It was literally the heart of the island for a very long time.
It was where the Sudric people fled to during times of foreign invasion.
Yeah.
And it's described in the book as being the place where the women and children stayed and lived when the men were out fighting the war. It was described the place where they took the injured and the sick who were fighting this war for 100 years to heal and recover. It was
that is so cool. That's amazing.
It's really the heart of the island.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, it was also described during the next several hundred years of conflicts in the British Isles, whether it be the English Civil War or the Jacobite rebellions. It was described as the location where the locals, harboring the people that they were fighting alongside, whether it be the Jacobites or I'm not sure which side, but a certain side, the Roundheads or the Parliamentarians in the English Civil War. But the parties in exile were harbored and hidden in Skarloey.
Right.
I imagine Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the leader of the Jacobite rebellion. It's in history. He hid out in a bunch of the islands off of Scotland,
right,
hiding from the English after when they were trying to kill him after the Jacobite rebellion, when he tried to retake the throne for the Stuart family and his father. He was literally harbored island to island in these local backwater areas that only the locals would know of, and the locals were all deathly loyal to him.
Right.
Meanwhile, the English crown was putting on massive bounties of huge amounts of money for his head and execution of anyone who would help him. But all these loyal Highlanders and Islanders supported him through it.
And that kind of
said in the book that the Jacobites passed through.
Right. And that kind of gives off that same feeling of magnanimity, that same feeling of looking out for someone in desperate need, and of shared allyship, and of shared interest. And it fits, is the best way I can put it. Like, the fact that this is the history of Skarloey makes so much thematic sense for the island and for this place.
And what this causes is the rediscovery of Skarloey. Meanwhile, when the railway was built, they thought they discovered it.
Right.
It was unknown. Because the book says that because it was no longer needed as a place to hide, those who had known its secrets died with them.
Wow.
The secrets of Skarloey died until the surveyors came through to build the railway.
Right. Yeah. So nobody. This is honestly, folks. This is kind of like the Great Waterton of the Railway series.
This is the Great Waterton. There's ruins of ancient buildings in Skarloey that are talked about, which the new hotels are built from.
That's so cool. And imagine when they build the railway, they don't. This is pre-1909. When they build the railway, they don't realize what they've stumbled upon. They don't realize the utter significance of it until this book at Ulfstead is found, until they have this historical context. And all of a sudden they realize, oh my god, our namesake station all this time has been what once was the heart of Sodor for 100 years. And somehow its energy, its pure significance has channeled through. I mean, it's
Well, before they discovered Skarloey, they originally were just going to run it as a freight line.
Right.
Because they thought it was going to go to nowhere and not have any value as passenger.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden they discover this lake in the woods, and they're like, "What is this?"
And developed a Victorian era spa town, a resort vacation town around it.
Yeah.
But by the 1950s, this Victorian era, 100-year-old, not quite ancient at this point, 80-year-old vacation resort was really run down, especially with 30 years of the lean years.
Right. Yeah. No, especially.
And so everything from the resorts and places in Skarloey itself, which still didn't have a road between Crovan's Gate and Skarloey at this point, and it was all run down.
Right.
But meanwhile, because of this discovery, because of how Lemmy and I are freaking out about the symbolic meaning of this, the island freaked out.
Yeah, in the same way that we are, because they realized all of a sudden what a big part of their heritage Skarloey is. And what are they going to do the second they hear that this place is so meaningful and so noteworthy? They're going to flock to it. And how are they going to get there? The Skarloey Railway.
And for marketing purposes for the spa town, all of a sudden you have claims from the 1200s of the waters being healing in the spas.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And all sorts of other things which go to further accentuate the descriptions in these books
it really takes this region of the island and it kind of mystifies it, kind of adds a bit of magic. It really kind of takes that whimsy that the Skarloey Railway is known for and what turns it into a tourist spot, and it injects that in because it wasn't there before.
So this creates a flock, a rush of visitors to the railway.
Yes.
And to Skarloey, to the Skarloey's taverns and hotels, and just to the railway itself.
Right.
And puts the infrastructure, which had been used to. I imagine the Skarloey Railway in the late 1940s being just the locals on their way to market for market day and back again. Like, I don't imagine it much more than that, and I don't imagine the hotels, the one or two hotels that would be left doing anything other than a handful of tourists in the summer months.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
I imagine it being all kind of in the last ropes and more just for locals and being really just philanthropists at this point.
Right. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, in that background, it's just a flood.
Yeah.
It's a flood of people, which could result in coming back year on year.
Yeah.
Which could result in these hotels and restaurants being rejuvenated in Skarloey.
Exactly.
It could result in the railway having a long-term, steady tourist and passenger traffic back to Skarloey.
But could is the key word, because there is a caveat here, and it is a huge caveat, is that they have to make a good impression. They have to shuttle people up there and back down and make sure they have a good time and a good trip. And there is one engine at the head of that train that is going to make that impression, that is going to make people want to come back year after year, that is going to save the railway. And that engine is Renea's.
And not to mention that the very revenue they're getting for these services is the first dollars they'll have to reinvest in the railway.
That's true, yeah.
So they both need to make a good impression to have it sustainable for the long term. But they also need to have these operations be profitable so they actually have money to buy new engines, to buy track repairs, to buy everything they need to buy.
Literally, the trains that Renea's is taking this year, this pivotal year, if he breaks down and everybody wants a refund, they want their money back, they don't have money. Straight up don't have money. Their bank account, they're totally broke. They need that money.
There goes Peter Sam. There goes Sir Handel. The engine's at his.
Oh, yeah, literally. That's the thing, though. It's like this money that Renea's is making right now is the exact same money that they're going to use to buy Sir Handel and Peter Sam in a year. I mean, that's mind-blowing. That exact same money that the passengers are giving them, the money that they will refund if Renea's breaks down in the middle of nowhere and simply can't take them up there, that they're going to lose out on that. They're not going to be able to invest in the railway. They lose everything. And this right here, this is why Renea's is probably my absolute favorite engine on the Skarloey Railway. I adore him as a character. People have heard me drone on about him a lot, I'm sure. But I adore him because all the pressure's on his shoulders. This is the pivotal point. This right here is the moment where the Skarloey Railway turns into a struggling, barely profiting, if not in fact not profiting railway, that is just barely skirting along for all these years, we take it from that and turn it into a tourism railway. Turn it into a place that people want to flock to, that everybody adores and is admired by the whole island over. A railway that will one day not just have one engine running, but 8 of them, and they're all necessary because there's that many more people coming to the railway. 8 times the amount of people. Can you believe that? Can you believe how much has changed about this railway because of what Rheneas did? Because that one pivotal year, he was able to actually keep this place running and make everybody realize what a key location to visit Skarloey really was. I mean, that's
only
amazing.
new track to be laid on Sodor on new railway beds after 23 was in the Skarloey Railway, both for the quarry extension and for the Lakeside Loop.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. The Skarloey Railway had more expansion than the Northwestern Railway did, because the Northwestern Railway just redeveloped things that were already there. The Skarloey,
same with the Arsdale.
Exactly. Yeah, the Arsdale just took the old mid-Sodor bed and okay, we'll use it again. The Skarloey Railway built a loop line. That's a big deal. They built a loop. The shape of the railway changed after a while. I mean, it's crazy to think about that the line used to just go to Rheneas and then swing down southward to Skarloey. You didn't have that whole big loop. I mean, if you picture how the Skarloey Railway looks on a map, which I'm sure many people are familiar with that shape, the very significant loop at the top of it, that wasn't there, and that wouldn't have been there if Rheneas had not been able to give these passengers a good time, these tourists a good time, if he hadn't convinced the whole island over that Skarloey was the place to be and that it meant something and it mattered to this island. And he did. And that's just, and not just Rheneas, but of course, Ivo Hugh and Peter Sam, 2 men that were just absolutely crucial to this, whose reserve was enough to keep the railway running. I don't even want to think about how little sleep they got every night. I don't even want to go there. How much time they were probably spending on the railway. How much maintenance they probably had to do at the dead of night with lanterns. It's...
And then the rest of their life's work running it and for the rest of their careers.
Exactly, yeah. No, I mean, they never left the railway, really. I mean, that was their whole life. And
what a way to get respect, and anyone should be able to respect either of them, no matter how fancy a suit Peter Sam would wear,
right,
and his job as controller.
And of course, that's an important thing to say, is that eventually Peter Sam does become the official controller of the railway. We're imagining him in overalls here, running the railway, in the greasy, coal-spattered cab of Rheneas, kind of rumbling along tracks that are about to give way underneath them. But Rheneas eventually becomes, he's Mr. So Mr. Peter Sam. Peter Sam becomes Mr. Peter Sam. I'll put it that way. A Mr. Finally appears before his name, and he becomes the controller of the Skarloey Railway. And that's the thin controller. That's the thin controller we all think of. That guy that we see as this very prim and proper kind of Mr. Percival archetype almost. He started out literally in the cab, on the footplate, on Rheneas, during those crucial lean years. That's how he started. And
as controller, that is. Because he had a career before that on the railway during the lean years of probably doing all sorts of other jobs on the railway.
Yeah.
But he started his career as controller by doing that.
Yeah, by literally started his career as controller as a driver. It was like, all right, I'm in charge now. What I'm going to do is run the engine because I don't have anyone to do it. Like, that's nuts, Yeah. But that just shows how much he cared, and the fact that, if as used to seeing him in a suit as we are, he got his hands dirty to make this railway a reality and to keep it alive. And of course, so did Ivo Hugh. I mean, he really, really did. So yeah, I mean, that is really the pinnacle of the lean years. That is really the make or break period where either tourists are going to come back. I mean, we all know that last line in Gallant Old Engine where it's like, we had a lovely time. We'll come back and we'll bring our friends. And hell, they did bring their friends. I mean, they really, really did. Because again, the traffic the railway got.
Industry.
Yeah.
It established a long-term business model for the railway and an industry,
Right.
which would make several people. It changed the economic impact of that region permanently.
It did. It did very permanently. And it's just amazing to me. It's like the Skarloey Railway's most successful period it isn't even based on slate. It isn't even back when they were, it's not back in the early days. Their most successful period is the period that we're all familiar with. It's after the 50s. It's when it becomes this tourist destination. And that's awesome. That's such an optimistic ending to this railway, such an optimistic future, that their success really does transpire when all this effort is put in and they just struggle so hard to keep this line alive. And then once they finally cement it, it results in the most prosperous period the railway's ever had, which continues to this day, which is just amazing. I love that. And that's thanks to Rheneas, and that's thanks to Ivo Hugh and to Peter Sam. And even to Sir Handel Brown II for taking a chance on them and delaying the creditors another year, which I'm sure that was hell for him, right? I mean, having to kind of stave them off and fight them off as, getting them a few weeks here and there so that they could just barely eke along and finally get the railway to the point where it could be profitable again. Those three men, and Rheneas, and of course Skarloey for putting in all that damn effort during the war and wearing himself out. That entire family of Skarloey workmen and engineers and engines, that is what defines this part of the island, this railway. And it's just stunning to me. It's one of the best stories that Sodor has to offer.
It is. It's in my opinion, it's the defining Sodor story.
It's definitely the most Sudrian thing, I'd say.
It's the most Sudrian thing. And, even beyond that, I see how this story paints the pictures of other things. Like Steamroller, for example, example of the story. In my take on Steamroller is George is pissed because he thought that the railway was going to close during the end of the lean years, because this was only years after that.
Oh.
And he was pissed that he had to build a road next to the railway, not on the railway. Like what was going to likely happen if the railway did close.
Oh my God. I'd never thought of it that way, but that's amazing.
Well, look at it. Like, we're talking about how close to closure it was.
Right.
Meanwhile, there was no direct road between Skarloey and Crovan's Gate. The only road to Skarloey is from the other side of the mountain.
That's fantastic. I love that years after the railway finds its success, everybody's still kind of shaken up about that. They're like, hold on a minute. They came back from the dead? They lived? I don't, like, nobody was prepared for that. It's kind of like that. What's the American election that they printed the newspapers before the results were out? The Truman election, I think it was. It's like that, right? Everybody was so ready for the Skarloey Railway to fail, and then it didn't. And it's like, that's just so badass, in my opinion.
That's my exact interpretation of the steamroller thing. And how George has to make that road right next to the railway.
Right.
He was meant to get the railway bed and the tunnels and all of that, just like what happened on the Mid-Sodor.
That's so...
where they built the road right down it.
That must be so humiliating for him. No wonder he's so pissed. That's great.
Yeah, that's my own headcanon, at least.
I imagine George could have been prowling around the area too, long before Sir Handel and Peter Sam showed up. He would maybe interface with Rheneas a few times and just be like, "Yeah, you see that track bed? That's gonna be mine soon." And Rheneas would be like, "Not if I can do anything about it." And then I imagine
could so clearly be the villain during the lean years.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Can you imagine that? That'd be great.
Also, in my headcanon, he turned part of the Mid-Sodor into a road.
So he has a serial kind of career of doing this. That's great. That's a great George idea. But you know what? I love the image in my head of Rheneas being off at the works, and then he just hears the news of Steamroller, and he just smirks slightly, like because he knows that George is pissed because they won.
It's just like. And why George just even seeing Sir Handel will make him pissed,
right?
Because it's like, it's not Rheneas, it's not the guy that's someone actually well maintained.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like he would realize instantly what that meant. Is like, hold on, they have more engines? No.
Exactly.
No.
And I see that being, it was the conclusion from a previous villain arc he had.
Exactly.
That's the villain of the lean years.
That's fantastic. I love that so much. That's great.
Oh,
goodness. But I think that more or less, I mean, that caps off the lean years. I mean, I really think that is that. I mean, we've explored it. I mean, that is the lean years right there.
That's the lean years, and I think this is such a great one to really kickstart the series with.
It really is, because we're just so passionate about this specific area of Sodor, and I hope everybody realizes why now, because there's a lot to talk about, and a lot of very interesting characters involved, and just a lot of triumph, a lot of hardship overcome to make this railway what we now adore it as. Why we all, I mean, the Skarloey Railway is such a favorite place among fans on Sodor. So you can imagine how the Sudrians feel. You can imagine how the tourists feel. I mean, if I lived on Sodor, I'd be taking a hell of a lot of trips up to Skarloey myself. So I see exactly why.
And I think Skarloey Railway suffers in the fandom from a lore perspective because everyone sees it as just Tallyland 2.0.
Right, and it's very different in some ways.
Copy and paste from Tallyland.
Yeah.
The history of the Tallyland is extremely different than this.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it has some similarities here and there, but it's the simplification of the of Skarloey history of being just the same as the Tallyland as a way over massive simplification.
Right. And that's the thing is it's the thing is the Skarloey wears the face of the Tallyland. It looks like it in terms of engines, which is what most people focus on, and in some superficial ways. And of course that connection is very historically important and comes up a lot in the books, but the history, the story, which is really the most important thing, the story of this railway is fundamentally different, and I just think so inspiring. And of course the Tallyland history is inspiring as well, but in totally different ways. That's a very, very different story right there. And this here is a quintessentially Sudrian story, which I just love. It adds such character and personality to this island, and it exemplifies a lot of the values of Sudrians. It exemplifies kind of that refusal to quit, refusal to give up, and refusal to give in to people who are trying to push you to close down, push you to change who you are. I mean, I think that's
it's
why.
The adversity to say, no one thought the railway was going to be profitable. It took two miracles.
Right.
Maybe they were praying to find another slate reserve and then keep going through limping on one leg.
Right.
And then maybe eventually replace him. But I don't know if Ivo and Mr. Sam were ever thinking they're going to get a paycheck out of this.
Right. they just cared. The work itself was the reward. That was really why they were doing it. And it's just it's powerful. There's such constitution in these men, such integrity, and such utter passion. It's like you really resonate with them because of how much they care and how much effort and sacrifice they put in. It's just, I just love it. It's so good.
I've ranted to many friends about the subject for a similar amount of time as this episode. And I just hope...
Yes, indeed.
We did not discuss beforehand our target timeline for this episode, or target timeline for the series going forward.
Right.
But I would certainly welcome feedback from the audience.
Oh yeah, for sure.
If you like this long format or you prefer smaller formats.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you guys. We just did what our hearts desired and talked about this. This is very much a peek into what me and Ted's conversations have been like all these years. This is very much how we talk to each other. And it's been thrilling. It's been a hell of a lot of fun. So I really hope that everybody's enjoyed it.
Well, signing off for now. This has been Oliver Duck, Ted speaking.
And Master of the Lemons, Lemmy speaking.
And I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about Sodor streets, statues, railways, people, places, history, and more.
Absolutely. Take care, guys.